start by welcoming everyone to today's webinar, where our topic is the Memphis project. It's Urban Wood Economy Initiative. And it's a topic I think that's very relevant for today, and we're going to learn some lessons about that are applicable to folks wherever they live. My name is Neil Letson. I'm a member of the Tennessee Urban-Forestry Council and will be your host this morning. And I also want to introduce Katie Donaldson, whose voice you heard earlier, and she is the person behind the scenes here and will be handling the technical aspect, the questions, and some other announcements. We'll hear more from her later, but I appreciate all that she does behind the scenes. For many of you, this is not your first view of our webinar. You're probably familiar with our routine, but we do have some first-time viewers, and I want to let them know that these webinars are brought to you monthly, free of charge, through a partnership between the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council and the University of Tennessee's Department of Natural Resources. Our sole purpose is to simply offer you, our viewer, a wide range of topics that will not only deepen your understanding of the importance of trees, but also hopefully inspire you to grow a healthier urban forest wherever you live and the places that we all live. But before we begin, we want to go over a few housekeeping items. And Katie, could you highlight some of those?
Yes, there we go. Couldn't unmute myself. If your full name is not your current Zoom profile name, could you please take a moment to change that to your full name to ensure we give you credit for attending if you would like a CEU for this webinar. You can also put your name in the chat along with your certification number. And for anyone who has not registered for this webinar, I'm going to put that link in the chat. That way you still have a moment to register because you must be registered in order for us to give you credit. But please do that. That helps me out a lot.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Katie. With no further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Jeff Carroll, and he's going to talk to us about the urban wood economy and his initiative with, I'm sure, some other communities, but Memphis in particular. And with that, Jeff, we'll turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's really a privilege to be with you. I'd like to say that I've been working in this space of urban wood and capturing it and getting it back into the marketplace for about a dozen years in a really kind of focused and concerted way. Started out trying to figure out how to get wood that was coming out of buildings into the marketplace when construction was demanding buildings get removed, and we would deconstruct those buildings. But quickly saw that the greater need and the higher volume of material was coming from trees coming down in the cities. And so I started to turn my attention to that in partnership with the USDA Forest Service, and then both municipal and state leadership in the cities where we were working. When I finally ended up in Memphis, working with the folks there, both the NGO community, the city, and then ultimately the state, I found folks that have been among the most supportive, most engaged, and creative thinking in how to go after some of these problems. And so while I love every place we work, I got to tell you, I'm just going to go on the record and risk the fallout of saying that the folks in Tennessee at the Division of Forestry and Department of Agriculture have just been absolutely amazing in ways that we wish we could get duplicated in states all across the nation. So hats off to the folks at Tennessee, and also the University of Tennessee, working with Sharon Jean-Philippe and working with a couple of their interns. Just again, fantastic partnership. So I just want to say thanks, first of all, to the folks from Tennessee and the partners that we have gained in being part of that work there. So I'm here to really talk to you primarily about the work that we're doing in Memphis, but the work in Memphis is part of a vision that we have for capturing urban and community wood, in particular, all wood that is being removed in a way that leads it to being taken to a landfill instead of a market. So if you think about it in those terms, we use the terms urban and community wood, but what we really mean is all wood that comes from trees that are taken down and headed to a landfill. We want to intercept that waste stream and bring that woody biomass material into a processing place and get it back into the marketplace. So that's really what we're at about the business of doing, and we're doing that currently in several cities, and I'll highlight those in a few minutes. But the Memphis project in particular has become sort of a crown jewel for us, a real flagship project. And so I'm happy to have an opportunity to talk to you about that one in particular. And then I'd like to spend a few moments putting in context of sort of our greater vision for doing this in other cities and how we think Memphis plays a unique role in that. Finally, once we get this done, we'll open it up for some Q&A and give you a chance to fire away. And if I have a decent answer, I'll give it. And if I don't, I'll let you know I don't have a good one. So I'd like to start by just sharing a deck with you that I'd like to walk through. That'll give you some graphical and some data that will help you get a grasp on what it is we're doing in Memphis and what our greater strategy is based on what's going on in Memphis. So I'm going to get this launched. Let's see, I think this should do the trick. Katie, is that looking like we're visible?
Yes, I can see your screen.
All right, let's see if that goes there. All right, very good. So we are Urban Wood Economy. And the thing that sort of drove us into this space was the first time I encountered these numbers. I saw from research by the Forest Service, David Nowak in particular, that there were 46 million tons of merchantable wood from urban trees, urban and community trees that were going into landfills. And I thought that was a staggering number all by itself. And then when you start looking at what the yields are on that translates into maybe as much as 7.2 billion board feet of lumber that could be produced from those trees. And that means that we're forfeiting an industry that's valued at somewhere around $750 million that you go, wow, that's not small. That's not just little bits of wood and small amounts of money. That is a real economic engine that is being ignored or not being addressed to the extent that it should be. I've always applauded the efforts of urban and community milling operations in cities around the country. They do a fabulous job of at least getting what they see as the most valuable pieces of wood and snatching them from the waste stream and turning them into very unique, highly differentiated products that have really strong margins and make it worthwhile for those individuals to do that. But when you start looking at this through a different lens, and that is that it's not just about me as an individual finding a way to carve out an industry for myself in a particular context, but it's really about the fact that we have so much material, and every pound of, or I should say every ton of biomass material, the woody material, 1,000 pounds of that is pure carbon. It's 50 cents on the dollar is carbon. And so when you start losing that much material and allowing those trees to either rot or get mulched or get incinerated, all that carbon is really very short-term released back into the atmosphere, binding with oxygen. It gets up to 3.6 pounds of CO2 per pound of carbon. So when you start multiplying the numbers, it's a huge amount of greenhouse gases that are going back into the atmosphere. And I don't even have good numbers on the methane, which is even more destructive. So when you start looking at just the climate aspect of it, you realize that these smaller operations in cities around the country, while they're absolutely fantastic, we love the products, are not significant enough in size and in volume to impact that reality of all of that carbon being lost. These trees have kind of faithfully sequestered carbon throughout their life. And as they come down earlier than they normally would because of our presence as an urban environment, all that carbon gets lost prematurely. If we could find a way to flatten that curve and keep that carbon sequestered longer, that would be an advantage. And then when you look at the numbers and you realize that all that economic value is being lost, not just in revenue that could be generated, but also avoided costs that are being forfeited because industry is paying to throw this stuff away. If we could capture the avoided cost, and then at the same time, we could generate additional revenue, now we'd be in a place where we could really maximize the economic impact and start to build what I like to call an economic engine around this particular industry sector. That means that you not only now have an actual industry sector that's hiring people directly, but you are also creating an industry sector that requires support. And so indirectly, you create actually an X factor of more jobs. So all that's being forfeited if we don't take a look at how we can intercept this massive waste stream. So in Memphis, just to give you a sense of how big this really is, because I just threw some numbers on there that had me impressed enough to get me into the game. But in Memphis, the public data says there's about 12,000 tons of wood waste annually going into the Shelby County landfills. However, we have an arboricultural partner there who's already committed to bringing us all of his wood, who told me that no, he by himself puts 10,000 tons of wood waste into the system. So if he's one person, and there's a bunch of them, plus the major players, the Davies and the Bartletts and the Asplins, if he's one player that's actually accountable for all that's on record, you start to get a pretty quick picture that what's being recorded is going into the public landfills is about a tenth, maybe it's 15% of all the material that's actually going in to some sort of landfill, whether that's a private or public, or it's being taken out, or it's being burned, or it's being mulched, but none of it is going into, I shouldn't say none, but such a small fraction of it is actually being diverted into true carbon capturing products. So we went ahead and structured ourselves as a 501c3. We are a consultancy by origin, and our real specialty is figuring out how to build the supply chain that is robust enough to intercept that waste stream and to get that material processed and into the marketplace at a pace and volume that actually begins to show up on the radar screen as having an impact on our environment and a socioeconomic impact on the metro areas where we do this work. And so we make it our point to aggregate public and private partners and to pursue funding to hopefully bring solutions to these metro areas. So we do this by thinking right from day one that we want a scalable project. And so that helps us fine tune who it is that we're going to work with. We were very fortunate in Memphis to get connected to the Works Inc., who had a strong presence in the city, very committed to workforce development. They have a strong emphasis on affordable housing, but also industry development in communities where economic opportunity have been compromised, or they are in distressed communities within the city. And so we made a really nice match together to take this particular kind of industry and sort of fold it into that greater scheme of serving Memphis in this economic way. And so we want to make sure we get the right partners so that we can go to scale. And that always includes the city, the state, and federal partners. But it also means finding people within the private industry. So, and you'll see as we explore more in these slides that we have partnerships with Anderson Tully, Classic American Hardwoods, And for people who process with Davy Tree, the leading arborist among the independents in Memphis, and then also end users, all of those key players that can complete the supply chain and allow us to, with some confidence, begin to aggregate that material, get it processed, and then back into the marketplace. We do these for very simple reasons. We're trying to capture carbon. We're trying to create jobs. We're doing that by striving for a zero waste facility. And we believe that in the long run, there's economic upsides for everybody as we avoid disposal costs and we incentivize the arboricultural community to think about how they remove trees in a way to preserve the greatest amount of economic value. I think all of you at one time or another have seen something like this. We keep talking about a circular economy, closed loop economy, virtuous cycles, you know, and I'm absolutely a proponent of all of it. But I think the thing that I would like to kind of slip in here by way of a challenge is that as we look at this particular cycle that starts with putting a tree in the ground in an urban environment or urban metro area, and then maintain that tree, and the day comes when that tree is about to die, and then we, instead of sending it to the landfill, aggregate it, process it, work with design and manufacturing to create product that can be sold and distributed to the end user, and then subsidize further tree planting from the margins that are created in between those steps. So that's a good model. But if we don't think really creatively about how we're approaching this, we could end up with a model that is sustainable, which simply means that we're not going to do any further harm, right? This is a balanced system if it's sustainable. But if we think a step further and say, how can we work an economic and environmental social impact cycle that actually leaves the city or the metro area that we have invested in better than we found it, moving beyond just being sustainable to regenerative, where we are really beginning to mimic nature's ability to have a zero waste system that actually improves over time if given that opportunity. And so we say that that can be improved if we think about how we aggregate and process and say that we're always going to commit ourselves to finding highest and best use, because it's not truly regenerative or even circular if we're just going to say we're going to aggregate it and then turn it all into mulch, because that's not the highest and best use for a beautiful white oak log. If we're not thinking about design, the folks like at Forest Products Laboratory, the Charlie Becker, if you haven't met Charlie Becker at Forest Products Laboratory, that may all by itself be the most important thing you learned today, is that you should know that person. He is abreast of all of the products that the Forest Service is working on and by way of research to develop so that wood has more and more outlets, and that means urban wood has more and more outlets. So even the design elements have to be intelligent so that we're striving for highest and best use of these products. Then when we go into manufacturing, we're doing a manufacturing of product that requires skill, that has something that's worth training people for and building a workforce around that leads to good jobs with benefits and good pay. And then when we finally get back to where we want to take some of these resources and put trees back in the ground, we want to plant trees that are going to serve their communities well while they're alive, but be able to contribute to the economic viability of this cycle when they come to the end of their useful life as a tree. So if we plant a lot of like ornamentals that don't have really any economic value at the end of their life, then we may get some, benefit from that ornamental while it's a tree, but once it's down, it's difficult to capture value from it. But if we really think carefully about what we put in the ground, we can accelerate this cycle over time to be virtuous and regenerative and not just sustainable. I'm going to leave that one there. So what about urban wood economy? Where are we at work? We're at work leading the coordination on something called the Urban Wood Academy. And heads up, I mean, the next one is in Memphis in November of 23. I will say, in all fairness, that it is a limited audience. You usually have to get invited. It's a little bit of an exclusive club. But people who are really committed to seeing wood utilization move to the forefront in how we think about the wood coming out of cities will certainly be folks that we'd want to see at that academy. Especially if we've got a lot of arborists, and I was told, ISA gets well represented here. We're ISA members. That we're really looking to include more input from both sources and uses. So arborists and tree removal companies, along with manufacturers and folks who are utilizing this material. We do have a project going in San Diego. That's where our last academy was. That one is very nascent. It's at the early stages. We have a project that's just looks like it's going to launch in Puerto Rico. We have a very strong project going in Pittsburgh, but then the one for our attention today is Memphis. So as soon as we started working in Memphis, the initial models that we had for that city were that we would be able to extract maybe up to 1 million board feet of lumber, which we thought was pretty sensational. The more we have researched and the more we've recognized how much material is coming out, we have upped that estimate to 2.5 to 3 million board feet of lumber annually, and still would have an excessive amount of wood, biomass material that could be turned into compost and biochar, a product that I'm sure many of you are at least aware of. I will admit that the markets for biochar are a little soft right now, and we're trying to work on that side of it to open up those gates. And part of that is working with our states to turn loose funding to subsidize the experimentation in the agriculture world with biochar. But we know there are lots of other applications, and but we're pressing hard on that. But we realized pretty quickly that it wouldn't be a big deal for us to push this out to 2.5 to 3 million board feet, and then to also have another 10,000 tons of compost and another 10,000 tons of biochar, all just on the Memphis site, just dealing with what we could reasonably pull in from Memphis urban wood. And then we started to do the measures again. We said, man, as exciting as that would be, and I'll tell you where we are in this process now, but as exciting as that would be, we really need to move this number from 1.5 to 2, 2.5 to 3 million, up to closer to 15 million board feet a year, and associated amounts of compost and biochar, in order to really start to make a dot on the radar screen in terms of climate impact and socioeconomic impact. It's at that point that we started to see numbers that were aggregating to a place where you could really measure them. And because this is fixed carbon, in other words, it's not a set aside. You'll hear people talk about carbon offsets where they'll say, well, we won't cut down this acreage of trees. And so this company over here can put a lot of carbon in the air, but say that they'll buy this acreage and not ever cut these trees down. That's a kind of carbon offset that I'm not as excited about. What I like is we have all of this wood in the urban and community environment that is going to a landfill, that is going to rot, that is going to release its carbon. And if we can intercept that and turn it into lumber, biochar, and compost, you can come and actually measure how much carbon was extracted from the waste stream and is now piled up in either piles of lumber, piles of biochar, piles of compost. So it's a fixed carbon. And that allows us to start thinking about how to participate in the carbon credit market in a way that is not smoke and mirrors, but it's a legitimate amount. But you can't even begin to touch that market without a significant volume. So once they become interested, now we know that we're extracting enough material to actually be impacting the planet, because the economy is telling us it's big enough to attract carbon credits. So that's our goal right now, is to keep working in Memphis, but then also make Memphis not just a place where we aggregate the material from Memphis, but we'd like to see Memphis become a place where we aggregate material from other cities. We have in Memphis now, we've secured 10 acres of real estate, and that is under development. We have a commitment from our local arborists for source of material. We have a commitment from processors and distributors to help us with getting the lumber that is produced out into the marketplace. And we actually have commitments from end users to purchase this material. We are currently raising funding for launch and expansion at full speed. We have some of that funding in place. We just need to, get the rest of it on board to get that project completely running. But we can see now with these commitments from major players that that funding will come, and that the model is pretty solid. So we said, what could we do if we wanted to make a solution that was even greater than that? And how could we get it done? What we've learned in talking to sort of B-level users, when I say B-level users, these would be companies that use a lot of wood. They're not the biggest companies in the country, but they're large, like Room and Board has been a major partner for us along the way. They would be comparable to a company like West Elm or Pottery Barn or Anthropology, or some of these furniture companies are ones that sell furnishings, and they use a lot of wood. But a fraction of their product line is actually using that wood. They want to use more, but they have said very clearly to me, we'd love to use a whole lot of urban wood. In fact, we'd build everything out of urban wood if we could, but we have a problem. We're never sure if you've got enough volume of material. We're never sure that there's good quality control across several sources of material. And therefore, we have a predictability or consistency problem. The challenge that I had, and I heard that, and I thought, how do you actually address that? Because as soon as you want to do that, you have to, that is, aggregate materials so that you'd have enough volume, enough quality control and consistency, is that you'd have to increase your carbon emissions, right? You'd have to truck this stuff into a centralized location. Or was there another way to do this? And so I started to look at Memphis, and I thought, we can do something significant in Memphis, but what if we wanted to do more in the center of the country, among both southern and Midwestern states? I said, let's just say that we've got all kinds of material also up in Minneapolis. We've got all kinds of material in St. Louis. And I would like to be able to aggregate that material, but I don't want to put them on a truck and truck them down because of the carbon penalty. And that's one of the reasons we're doing what we're doing, is to avoid carbon emissions. And so usually these things stay localized. But what if we use the river? What if we use the barge system to transport this material? I learned in the process that a barge uses about 97 cents of fuel per ton mile, as opposed to a truck, which uses $5.35 per ton mile. And the rail sits solidly in the middle. But if you can, instead of using truck, use a barge for the sort of point-to-point delivery, we could, at better than 1/5 the carbon penalty, get material moved to an aggregation point where we could acquire the volume and ensure the quality and have the predictability necessary. So what if we wanted to add Chicago? You have the canal systems in the Illinois River. What if we wanted to add Pittsburgh, where we have a project now, Cincinnati and Louisville, all on the Ohio River. Kansas City is on the Missouri. Little Rock is on the Arkansas. Knoxville on the Tennessee. And then since this graphic, we are now targeting Nashville as what we think will be a major contributor to urban wood source. And they're on the Cumberland. Now, all these flow pretty directly into Memphis. And so what could we accomplish if we did that? And first of all, let me say that when I first thought of this, first thing I did was share it with a bunch of smart people to see if I was crazy. And so I shared it with state foresters, who I believe are some of the brightest and most grounded people I've ever met. And I was at the National Association of State Foresters meeting, and I met with the Urban and Community Forest Subcommittee and asked them, please help me think through this. Is this realistic? And they were really supportive of this approach of using the river system to reduce carbon impact, and yet get that aggregation that we need to be a real player in the marketplace. And so partnering with the Works in Memphis, and then also USDA Forest Service. We have our partner in Room and Board in Minneapolis, Davey Tree, which is all over the country. Classic American Hardwoods, which is in Memphis, is a massive processing facility there. Anderson Tully Company, been around for 130 years, knows how to move wood. All of these have become our partners from the supply chain perspective. We also, and Woodland Tree Service is the largest local tree removal service in Memphis. We also are working with Tennessee Division of Forestry, Tennessee Department of Agriculture and Business Development, and University of Tennessee at Knoxville, where our interns are from, but also leveraging their insight, research, and experience to think through how to best do all this. So we've developed this and are in the process of building this out, believing that Memphis is the place where we could do this aggregation. So if you think about it this way, we'd like to see multiple what we call tier 1 sites producing 1 million board feet of lumber, 10,000 tons of compost, and 10,000 tons of biochar. We would want to stick that lumber onto a barge and send that to a tier 2 site in Memphis, where it would be resawn. We would ship cants probably, and then we would resaw, do our gang ripping, optimizing, sorting, drying, and handling for distribution out of Memphis. And why would we do that? Because our partners in Memphis have been doing that work forever. Anderson Tully, 130 years. Classic American Hardwoods, over 20 years. These are high output facilities that have extra capacity, and they have agreed to partner with us to process our material. They can do it so much faster and cheaper than we can do it in these individual operations, that the more we can centralize that capacity and core competency, the more efficient we get. And now we're driving the price of this lumber into a range where it's competitive. Are we ever going to be able to compete straight up with rural forestry? Never. But can we get it close? Yes. And because it is urban and community forestry, because it is wood that would have otherwise gone to the landfill, it has the attraction of its climate impact. It also has the attraction of its social impact, because it's generating jobs in some of our more challenged communities and cities across the country. That by itself makes it more valuable to the current market. And Room and Board is a testimony to that. If you've never been to their website, go and look at their urban wood collection, the products that we contributed to by extracting wood from row houses in Baltimore and in the surrounding areas, now contributes to 2 lines of furniture for them. The sales and distribution arm that we created back then is now a wholly owned for-profit industry that sells wood to Room and Board for those 2 product lines. We want to do that 100 times over. So why do we want to do it? I mean, why would any of you want to participate? I think the outcomes are compelling. We can actually work towards a zero waste facility. Every tree that you as an arborist bring onto the site will come to our site and not leave without a price tag on it. It will either be lumber, biochar, or compost. There is honest, measurable carbon capture here. We will create jobs, and ultimately this can contribute. If you're here as a policy person for states or cities, this can contribute to state climate action plans, and it certainly will contribute to the general wealth of the community. I'm going to stop there and field some questions. I guess we got about 25 minutes there. Unless it goes quiet, then I'll keep talking and I'll punish you for not asking questions. So, Kate, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. And I'll give y'all a second to list any questions you might have.
Little shout out to the guy from Port Tobacco, Maryland. Used to marina a boat not far from there in a place called Goose Creek Marina.
Here's a few coming in now. Will there be any labeling or certification that brands wood products as reclaimed urban wood waste products that might help in marketing?
Yes, that's a great question. This is an ongoing discussion, by the way, as to what does it mean? You know, what is urban community wood? You heard me say earlier, for me, this is wood that would have otherwise gone to a landfill. General and rural forestry is when they go in and cut down trees, those are headed for market. But this would be material that would otherwise be headed to a landfill. And so anything that falls into that category, we're classifying as this kind of, salvaged, captured wood from the landfill. And it falls into this category of urban and community wood. The certification of it really rests in your ability to prove chain of custody. And so we have two things that we think make it fairly easy to do. There are applications where you get the arborist to participate with simply plugging in where the tree came from when it lands at our site. You know, we then continue that chain of custody. But the truth is, if it comes from an arborist, you know, you're 99% sure that that was material that was going to a landfill. And so if that's the only material we're taking, then we already know there's a certain amount of certainty. The processing plants easily can contain whatever came from us, comes out to us. So that's not a problem. And right now, this may change as the volume of material gets greater. But right now, we're finding that the retailers who have a lot of sway with their customer base, if they simply say to them, this is urban and community wood, then the customer base believes it. And I'm sure that they want to have integrity about that, because if you're ever uncovered, that would be a bad thing. So I think the important thing for us to our end users is to be able to demonstrate a chain of custody, so that if we're ever audited on it, we could demonstrate, yes, this is all urban and community wood. But there are some efforts at certification. SFI, Sustainable Forest Institute, just recently issued some. Paul Johnson's been leading that team, and they just came out with some, and I haven't read down through all of them yet. It's fairly hardy. But there's going to be ongoing efforts to do that.
Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in now. What about the existing urban recovery companies? How do they fit into the system?
That's a great question too, because our particular model is that we want to take whatever comes to us and turn it into either lumber, biochar, or compost. A lot of your other recovery companies that have got their own milling operations, they've got a Lucas mill, they've got a mill shop, where they're making furniture, and they're capturing this value and upvaluing it into something very unique, very special, that usually has a pretty good margin on it. A lot of these are surfaces, tables, bar tops, doors, that kind of thing. We would not be, contending with that at all. We don't really want any piece of that particular market, because that is about craftsmanship and makerspace and creating product that is uniquely differentiated from anything else you can get anywhere else. For us, we want to be able to support that community by generating lumber at a price point that's less than what they can generate it for themselves, if they want to just use dimensional lumber, but also to go into higher volume manufacturing processes, because our goal is not an artisan one. Our goal is a carbon capture one and a job creation one. And so I have talked to a number of people that, and some of these current users have been a little distressed by what I talk about. And I go, this is a both and. I mean, the supermarket never replaces the farmer's market, and the farmer's market never replaces the supermarket. They both coexist very, very nicely because they do very different things. And so I think that's where we're at. The truth is, we've still not seen what happens when we go to this sort of high volume intake of material. So there are questions. We don't know fully, but in my understanding of the market, it's two different tracks.
Will you coordinate with cities and towns along the Ohio River or just larger markets?
That's an issue of economies. So there's only, I've learned so much about barges in the last 3 months, but there's only so many stops you can make. So you have to be able to have some level of local aggregation, because once you pull that barge in, there's a certain amount of cost associated with stopping it. And there's a certain amount of cost of having a new loading effort, right? There's that stop and start is always a little bit costly. Now, it's still very economical to ship things on the barge. However, stopping too many times will be difficult, and we won't even be able to find a barge company that would be willing to do it. So we're twisting some arms right now to say, will you start in Pittsburgh, stop in Cincinnati, stop in Louisville, stop in St. Louis, and then deliver in Memphis. And we've got some folks willing to do that now, but it's not easy that way. So that's part of the challenge with too many stops. That said, if we have a defined loading point, aggregation and loading point in each of those cities, there's nothing to say that surrounding areas couldn't do one leg in, like spokes on a hub, and then there would be an acquisition of material right there. We'd buy the material as it is right then and put it on the barge and go. So we're already exploring how we can get a spoke and hub model going in each of those individual urban centers.
Can you talk about what the suppliers tree services get, if anything, for delivery wood or chips, free or low cost dump site, or is there an incentive for some materials?
That's a great question. It's all about the economics, right? So right now we're running our model based on a 0 tip fee. So you pay nothing to come and deliver. As long as you deliver logs, we take it all. So that you don't have to just deliver logs. You would deliver logs and all your other stuff, and we'll take it all. But if you deliver logs too, 0 tip fee. The flip side of that is, if you did just deliver logs, we would talk about buying those logs from you. So we would be a purchase site on that, in that situation. So but honestly, right now we've got pretty good interest from the arborist in Memphis. If we'll simply do these things, be open and stay open, so that they can come and actually empty their trucks. Too often they get to a public landfill and then the landfill's on fire, or it's been closed because it's full. And now they've taken all that time to go to the landfill to dump, and now they can't. So they got to take it back, dump it on their own property, or wait and go ahead again in the morning. So having conducive hours so that you can get to us early in the morning and get your stuff unloaded and have an empty truck for the day. And always taking it. Once you get there, we're going to take it. And then to dump at no cost to you, as long as you're bringing us logs. We think that right now, the arborists in Memphis are saying that is incentive enough. to bring it. In contrast, in Pittsburgh is a unique city, 3 rivers, that all converge there in the center of the city. And there is no real beltway around Pittsburgh. And so it's very challenging to get from one side of the city to the other. Memphis, you have what we call the Memphis Loop. It's Interstate 40 and 240, right? In Pittsburgh, you don't have it. And so if they take a tree down on the south side of the city, they're not driving to the north side of the city to get rid of that material, no matter what your incentive is. And so we're looking at, decentralization of sites, or picking the side that produces the most material as our initial effort, or possibly partnering with the arborist companies to actually go pick up their logs. So at least they don't have, if they lay them on the front, we'll go get them. But I will say that is an in-formation model. We do not have that one figured out for Pittsburgh. But it just goes to show you that as you go from region to region, you face different challenges.
And I'm going to go ahead and ask this because we have a couple people who have asked this question. What length of log is ideal?
8'6". We got just enough extra. An 8-foot log allows you to generally maximize the amount of yield, from a tree. A 10-foot log is also good, but when you get out longer than that, if it's a 16-foot long and it's got a little bit of a curve in it, when you run it through the saw, you're going to lose a lot of that wood. And so we'd probably end up cutting it in half anyway, that's the optimum, because obviously 8 foot is what we're all used to working with from material, but that also maximizes the yield on every tree.
Is there any use for softwoods like cottonwood and willow? That's mostly what we cut down in my area in the Southwest, and that came from Colin McKim.
Okay, yeah, cottonwood. We're really taking a hard look at cottonwood in the music industry. Believe it or not. We have a strong connection. The gentleman who helped me start this was a guy named Mike Bourne, who has spent 40 years milling, processing, and selling hardwoods around the world. And one of his biggest clients has been the musical instrument industry. Fender guitar, he was the lead buyer for them for 10 years. Gibson currently has contracts with them. Taylor Guitar, Rickenbacker. I mean, he's bought wood for all of them. And so he's really tuned into the fact that Emerald ash borer has just given a beating to the electric guitar industry, because they make all those bodies out of swamp ash. And so with those taking a hit, they're looking at alternatives. And so anything that you've got that's sort of light and resonant could be a candidate for that. And there's a significant amount of wood that goes out into that particular industry. So that's just an example, but our partners in the furniture world want to make things work. And so if we say to them, look, we have a pretty steady supply of cottonwood, we have a pretty steady supply of, they'll let their design team start to think about what they can do with that particular species. So while I can't tell you for certain right now that we can sell all the cottonwood you can cut, I can tell you that there is a lot of flexibility in the marketplace for hardwoods from around the country that were not always in big demand or always used. And especially since the most popular ones like white oak and ash are now either scarce or prohibitively expensive, they're looking for alternatives.
How do you deal with local politicians or elected officials to get their support?
You make them sound like they're bad people. They're actually, I always remember that, people are people, nothing more. I don't care where you are, what level of government you're dealing with. They are there for a reason. Almost everyone that I have met that got into public service got in to solve problems. Like, they really do want to solve problems. And if you come to them with an intelligent solution, anyone that's been in the game for a while, they're always skeptical. Anything that sounds too good to be true probably is. And so there's always a degree of skepticism. What I have found, though, is if I'm patient and I give good information and I give those individuals, especially agency heads, a chance to digest it and think it through, and I'm clear about what the compelling value proposition is for the city, they'll listen. If I'm just, hey, I got an idea, they haven't got time for that. You have to come well prepared, and then it helps to build partnerships in the private sector who have influence on the public sector. And so those are two things that I've found helpful.
This person says they always assumed most urban trees are open grown, so not straight enough, and tend to have multi-leaders. Is this a problem?
Yeah, it's a good observation. That is true, that you have less like tall straight trees because they don't, fight for light like a rural tree does. But there are also lots of sources of trees within a city where they do get to kind of fight for light and grow straight and tall. So street trees, a little tougher. You're going to get a good log once in a while. But the trees that are growing on people's property, and that's where the bigger opportunity is in the private properties, where individuals aren't managing their estates. They're taking down big trees that have lots of great millable material in them. So your observation is correct. I mean, a street tree is a tough thing to work with sometimes, but at the same time, there's a street tree in Southern California called chamois ash, sort of a black ash, and it is almost all street trees down there. And Taylor Guitar now makes a line of acoustic guitars that uses chamois ash for their backs and sides. And so while you may not get the 8-foot log out of some of the street trees, if it's the right wood, maybe that's where we go to a 6-foot section or even a 4-foot section, and it goes into a different, marketing line. But we're trying hard to be creative and make sure that we can get maximum use out of these trees. But you're spot on. It's trickier.
There is interest in doing this in the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Oregon area. Are there any plans to expand into that region?
Yeah, there's some great folks up there working on some of this stuff now. Their focus historically has been more on the wood coming out of buildings. They've had, like, Portland's had a deconstruction ordinance for a number of years now, and they just made it stricter. There's real pressure to do reuse of materials coming out of buildings. The tree side of it is a little bit more nascent, a little more, early stages in comparison. And but they've always been leaders in the reuse space. So I would expect that there will be people that will rise up on this. The folks that I'm working with, the closest I get to that market is Northern California, where we're just in the beginnings of talking with an organization up there that is harvesting urban trees. But I mean, up there we're talking beautiful big redwoods and stuff that comes down on people's properties. I mean, it's pretty amazing. But that's really fledgling at this point. And right now we can only really kind of focus so widely. So I already feel like pretty ambitious. So
similar question. Is anyone doing this in the Great Lakes area? They think
Yes.
the lakes might be a low-cost way of moving wood around.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of what I call, like, you have your real boutique shops, that just do really super high-end stuff. And then you get something in between what I'm talking about and that. And so there's a group in Minneapolis, called Wood from the Hood. There's another one in Wisconsin called Wonderwood. Those guys are doing 250,000 board feet a year each. So they're not huge, but that's, that's a chunk of wood. And they're also making furniture. So they own their whole supply chain. They work with the local arborist, and but they just take the logs and they buy those logs and so forth. So they're really focused on lumber and furniture, where we're looking more at biomass as a whole. But they are doing a really nice job in the sector that they're working in. Would love to see them expand, or have somebody expand to pick up these other materials. But I would say, that would be a place to start. And the base for the Urban Wood Network is in Michigan. Carrie Devine and the Urban Wood Network is always a good place to touch base. A lot has been done in that particular part of the country.
What is your percentage of hardwood to softwood?
We're like 99% hardwood. I don't know what will happen as we move more, southerly. There is obviously a lot of softwood, and then I grew up in the state of Maine in the logging community there, and we got a lot of fir and pine and spruce. So I don't know what'll happen if we move into those topographies that have so much more softwood, but you'll find that the stuff that's coming down in cities, in urban areas, is predominantly hardwoods, and that's where our focus is. But if we end up with a place where there's just a lot of pine, then we're gonna figure out what to do with that.
Does your model involve paying for the trees, or do you rely more on donated material to an urban site for shipping? If you do pay, what kind of prices are involved?
Yeah. So right now we would be the equivalent of, we'd be taking the place of your landfill, right? If you're for all of your woody debris. And so the price, in a sense, is an avoided cost to you that we don't charge for you to dump it. If you just brought logs, the going rates are somewhere around, depending on species and the quality of the log, let's just say 10 to 20 cents a board foot based on a Doyle scale for a log. So a beautiful 8-foot walnut might be $300, $400, I don't know, something like that. Something of lesser quality might be less, for just the log. But I'm pulling that number out of my ear right now, right? So I think 10 to 20 cents a board foot using a Doyle scale on a log is probably pretty close.
Is there any market for urban pure log chip and lumber industry?
Say that one more time, please.
Is there any market for urban pure log chip in lumber industry?
I don't know that the designation of it being urban will add any value to it yet, unless we can say that, hey, I've got biochar here that was made exclusively from, but almost all biochar is coming from byproducts that would have either rotted or gone to a landfill, or whatever the case may be. So I don't know that you'd get a premium for it being urban, but there's certainly a demand for that chip, as there would be for any chip like that, as long as the facility is set up to convert it, to process it into either biochar or compost.
And just a few more here. Have you considered working with local electrical utilities, since they're consistently pruning to meet standards and they end up removing a lot of trees?
Yes. That's the big answer. Yes. For Memphis, we're going to start with a more controlled intake. working with arborists who we have partnered with and that are willing to help us regulate that flow at the beginning. As soon as we feel confident that we've got it greased, we would open up the gate to utility clearings. That's obviously a huge supply, but you also have a lot less flexibility and there's a lot less community commitment, like there is with a local arborist who's part of that town and that city wants things to go well. There's just a different relationship professionally and personally. So
what is the minimum diameter log that would work in this system? Would you have smaller bandsaw mills to deal with smaller materials for specialty uses?
that's a great question. We look for a 16-inch log is sort of the bottom end. We are going to be using, a high-speed commercial milling operation to get these things into cans, quartered and into cans, then put them onto the resaw machines. But I don't envision us doing like slash wood, if that's really the question. I think that for us would end up being chipped, ground and turned into biochar or compost.
And I saved this for last. Someone asked if they could get the presentation material and if they're free to share it with members of their organization.
Yeah, let me double check on that. I know this is recorded anyway, so you can see it that way. I'm working with a couple of organizations on this plan to expand, and I'm the person that just says, tell the world, man, let everybody know so that we can get more players in here to help us. And they're saying, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. Maybe we ought to keep it under hat. And I go, nah, let's just tell the world. And so let me just check with them before I give away the presentation as a presentation. If it's here on this and you can go back and view it again, then that's fine with me,
All right, those are all our questions.
All right,
Bill.
thank you. Great questions, by the way. Thank you so much. Really a privilege to be here with you today.
Okay, Katie, I'll second that as well. Jeff, I'd have to say you gave a great presentation, lots of super information, and I really love how you told us really the complexity of putting all this together, how holistic it was and is, and comprehensive, and all the people that you've involved. And I know that takes a lot of hard work, but I think that paves the way to greater success. So I look forward to great things in the future. And if I can, maybe we can get you back next year to give us an update on the Memphis project and share some more lessons learned and also the successes that I'm sure they're going to enjoy.
I would love to do that. I will be giving an update at the ISA conference in Chattanooga. It will not be this elaborate. I'm doing a lightning round update, just 7 minutes to say this is the progress we've made. And then I'll be presenting a fuller program at the Southern Group of State Foresters if we've got any of those folks on this call. So, but yeah, happy to check back in a year. That'd be great.
Okay, well, try to keep your busy calendar open, at least where we can squeeze you in.
Absolutely.
All right. And I have a message for those of y'all that are still hanging on, which tells me that a lot of folks really stuck with you and it resonated with them. I feel that what you've talked about is also inspirational to cause action. And if anybody in the audience, for those of you that feel like you've learned something that you want to apply in your community related to the urban, I'll call it the urban wood economy. If you could share that in the chat room, we'd like to know. It's a way of helping us better understand that our presentations are meaningful to you, and also encourage us to look for other ways to provide presentations like this. And I'm sure, Jeff, that you have stimulated a lot of thinking and maybe even some local applications to the points you've made. which is what you want to do.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up. I would love to hear your feedback. It's always good for me to just know how to better communicate to this audience or an audience like this. And so, yeah, if so inclined, that would be deeply appreciated.
Okay, well, we'll share that with you. And Jeff, I am going to ask you to hang on. We're going to close it in just a second. Hang on just a few minutes more. But with that, I want to thank you again for the time you've taken to give us an update on the Memphis project, the urban wood economy. I learned a heck of a lot, and I'm very optimistic of the future of how we handle this valuable resource. So with that, thank you. And that will conclude this webinar. So stay
Thank you
with us,
very
Jeff.
much.